Morton County Sheriff's Department.
Hi, I need to report an assault.
Okay, where did it occur at?
It's happening right now.
Okay.
What
town?
It's on the Sacred. It's up at Standing Rock. They're innocent, unarmed people being attacked with water in freezing cold temperatures. Unarmed people. It's happening right now. There are militia-style police firing at point-blank range with high-powered mace on unarmed people. Who protects the people?
I arrived in August of 2016. I had inadvertently sent my little brother and sister up there trying to get them to do something post-college. And they pretty much showed up, made a bunch of friends. And when I got there, they were like, hey, this is our big sister. She's going to take care of us. And all of a sudden I had like 30 youth to care for. In that time, after the International Indigenous Youth Council was formed, we experienced our first act of violence directly from the mercenaries that worked for the Dakota Access Pipeline. And they unleashed dogs on our women and men and had dogs biting and making our people bleed.
Are you telling the dogs to bite the protesters? The dog has blood in its nose and its mouth.
And she's still standing here threatening.
You can't put your blame on the dog. You're an evil woman. You can't put your blame on the fucking dog.
That's treatment against
your people. You will like that.
That was in September 2016. In October, we had our first use of Brent militarized police force when they came to raid one of our prayer camps. They actually brought in tanks and these MRAPs, various, I guess, different weaponries, like these loud sound equipment monitors that emit this really awful noise that kind of make you want to drop to your knees and you lose all your equilibrium.
I have to use headphones or earphones because they have a sound gun that they turn on intermittently, and it freaking hurts.
They also brought in water tanks that they didn't end up using until November. At another point, they escalated from the mace that they had been using to tear gas, from the tear gas to the concussion grenades that they shot into the crowds at people. They were shooting military-grade beanbags at us, rubber bullets. We also had several instances of uses of water cannons. Actually, they were pumping the water that we were trying to protect into these water cannons to shoot them at us in negative 25-degree weather in the middle of November. It seemed like what started with, attacks on us from these mercenaries that had been hired by the pipeline companies then escalated to the involvement of the local and state governments, the state-sanctioned violence, which then moved into inviting police and law enforcement from 5 neighboring states that then came in support with the National Guard to stand against a bunch of natives in moccasins fighting to protect water.
There were a lot of people, water protectors, activists, allies, who gathered near the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota to challenge a pipeline that was being built by the government there through the water of the tribe and creating a lot of other environmental problems. The state and local police reacted quite seriously by surveying and by trying to shut down the protests. The FAA also enacted what are called no-fly zones to limit the ability of drones and other media to document what was happening, especially around some of the biggest police activity that was happening on the ground. The protests were successful in stopping the permit for a bit, but then ultimately the construction continued. And not only the protesters were arrested and affected, but also individuals who were there to document the protests, including reporters like Amy Goodman and also Indigenous reporters.
There is an arrest warrant out for journalist Amy Goodman because she had the audacity to be a journalist. She was reporting on the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Native Americans that have been protesting it, reporting on dogs being geared toward some of the protesters in a violent fashion. She got arrested for trespassing.
One of the big trends that we've seen with this anti-protest legislation generally is that it seems to be reacting to the most successful, most powerful tactics that are used by protesters. So a lot of the bills that we've seen respond to the anti-pipeline protests near Standing Rock and other related protests, also racial justice protests in Missouri that shut down highways to protest the police killing of Mike Brown. So it really is, rather than reacting with substantive change to the things that the protesters are speaking out about, it looks like state legislators are reacting to the tactics and trying to make that attempt to make their voice louder actually quieter, making it harder for them to speak out and talk about the things that they find troubling in society.
Just a little bit of context. A little bit over a year ago, The Intercept got a tip from a contractor working for Tiger Swan, which is a mercenary security firm. And this firm had been doing a lot of contract work overseas, mostly in Afghanistan and Iraq. But at this point, they were working in the US for Energy Transfer Partners, which is the oil company behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. They had hired them, supposedly to do security work for the pipeline. But what the documents that this tip ended up revealing showed is that actually the kind of work they engaged in was much more sweeping and broad. It was really a massive surveillance project that Tiger Swan undertook on behalf of Energy Transfer Partners. For months, they surveilled, infiltrated activist communities, both at Standing Rock and then later in their neighboring states. And they started following progressive groups all across the country. And the documents we obtained include detailed descriptions of all of this surveillance work. They name hundreds of people that were involved in pipeline protests. And in some cases, they revealed that the private security firm were following them around, chasing them with their cars, definitely doing a lot of surveillance on social media, as well as doing radio eavesdropping and using all kinds of technologies to listen in on these movements, and again, infiltrating them as well. And then in addition to this, what the documents also showed is that this company didn't really limit itself to surveillance, but they also engaged in essentially a propaganda effort by which they were creating their own news reports and sharing them on social media and trying to put a spin on the narrative around the protests. So it was really quite extraordinary. It was far beyond what we think of security companies as doing in these kinds of situations. It's really quite fascinating, and it does show the background that this firm had in the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of the memos that we obtained, at some point these memos describe the water protective movement, which is a peaceful movement, as an ideologically driven insurgency with a strong religious component. And they even compare the anti-pipeline protesters to jihadist fighters. They have this absurd quote that I like to read to people because it just kind of shows the insanity of it all, where they basically say that the water protector movement generally followed the jihadist insurgency model while active. And so we can expect the individuals who fought for and supported it to follow a post-insurgency model after its collapse.
It's a full-on terrorist attack. Mass surveillance keep the rioters intact. But that's a lie and we know the full facts. U.S. patrol on the troll as you scroll my facial recognition tally up the toll my. We in the streets, you can wear that blindfold my. From Standing Rock to Ferguson, we on our own my header. We in an open air prison, tear gas, freezing water, it's beyond chilling. No more division, of well wishing. In dark days, we the prism. You want this oil, we the chrism. You want this soil, you a pilgrim. You did this to our ancestors, not our children. The urgency is beyond insurgency. Who you call when 911 is the enemy emergency.
North Dakota lawmakers are proposing new legislation that could make life tough for any future protesters there. That legislation includes an exemption if motorists accidentally injure or kill a protester by running over them on the road. It comes after months of rallies against the Dakota Access Pipeline and confrontations with police.
As far as any protest bills that have been introduced in North Dakota, I mean, they're not just there. Here in Minnesota, the state that I'm currently in, they're introducing anti-protest bills as well because people here are gearing up to fight Line 3. We have anti-protest bills in Virginia because they're fighting, I think, the transatlantic pipeline out there. We have anti-protest bills going up in Canada because they're fighting Kinder Morgan.
You should leave! You should leave! Because those seats you sitting in will be replaced by somebody who will shut it down!
The angry crowd erupted after the House Civil Law Committee approved a bill which would allow protesters to be sued to recover costs for what the bill calls illegal demonstrations.
Most of what we've seen has been state legislation, and that is actually where most of this change can happen. So that's really the level to watch, because most laws that have to do with protest, they come in the form of criminalizing or adding penalties to things like trespass and obstruction of traffic. And those are things that are criminalized generally at the state level. We see that even in the specific terms of the legislation, where they really try to mischaracterize this peaceful protest as economic sabotage or economic terrorism, completely misconstruing what these folks are doing and using language, which is obviously incredibly powerful, to change the way that protesters are seen in people's minds and how protesters may even be willing to perceive themselves in terms of, worry about associate themselves with something that they don't believe themselves to be associated with. So North Dakota was the state that saw by far the most of these bills actually pass into law. Other bills that were proposed included these quote unquote hit and kill bills that basically said that a driver who was exercising his quote unquote right to drive would not be held liable if he accidentally hit a protester who, happened to be pushed off of the sidewalk into the street at a mass protest. Other versions did focus on what legislators deem quote unquote critical infrastructure sabotage, or their attempt to protect critical infrastructure that really, in other words, is targeting anti-pipeline protests that focus on trespass specifically of quote unquote critical infrastructure, which isn't necessarily even a term that's been defined before in some places, or where it has been, there's already a law prohibiting this.